U.S. Central Command this morning reports that a fourth U.S. service member has been killed in action after getting seriously wounded during Iran's initial attack. CENTCOM adding that the identities of the fallen are being withheld until 24 hours after their next of kin is notified. Meanwhile, President Trump says the joint U.S.-Israeli military operation against Iran, it could last up to 5 weeks. And joining us now with analysis is Rod D. Martin. He's a geopolitical analyst and the founder and CEO of Martin Capital. Rod, always great to have you with us. I want to take a wider look, as is your expertise. But before we go there, very specifically, we just saw at the Pentagon the press update, the first from Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane. Your reactions?
I thought they did a fantastic job, and Secretary Hegseth in particular made the point that has been driving me absolutely crazy my whole life, that administrations since basically the time I was born have felt a need to telegraph all of our plans to our enemies through the media, which is insane. It's absolutely absurd, and it's unnecessary. The American people can receive more than adequate information to be able to make proper judgments and hold their government accountable without us being stupid. And the secretary did a great job of laying that case out. I am so impressed with this administration. They're effective, they're fast, and they're smart.
Yeah, and I appreciate you breaking that down, Rod. But while I have you, I definitely want to explore the wider geopolitical situation, of course, heavily focused on Iran this morning. But you penned an article last week about the military operations, and you discussed the significance of India coming back to the tariff negotiating table, agreeing to stop buying Russian oil, using its navy to actually shut down shadow fleet oil from Iran and Venezuela. China heavily reliant on that Iranian oil. So how does all of this now play into the current state of things?
Look, all of these individual operations have their own significance, their own importance, and their own meaning, but all roads lead to China. This administration is absolutely committed to dealing with the number one geopolitical threat we face, the one that periodically threatens to nuke Los Angeles, the one that periodically saber rattles in the direction of Taiwan, the one that could potentially actually get us into a global conflict. And that's what we saw with the Indian operation that was so extraordinary this week. India has always pretended to be non-aligned. They're leaders and founders of the non-aligned movement. But the truth of the matter is they've always been semi-aligned with Russia. And in the process, especially during the Ukraine war, they have been buying just an extraordinary amount of Russia's sanctioned oil exports. That oil absolutely pays for the Ukraine invasion. So to see what happened in the last few weeks is extraordinary, and here's what it was. On February 2nd, after all kinds of back and forth and all kinds of face saving, India and the United States signed a trade deal that is shockingly impressive. 18% tariffs on Indian goods coming into the United States, 0% tariffs on American goods going into India. This just flips the script. This is an extraordinary thing. India has always been extremely protectionist. Okay, so that's good news. That's good news for actually both sides because it levels the playing field in a way that will actually ultimately be good for both sides. It actually lowers the trade barriers for both sides. But that's not the story. 4 days later, just 4 days later, India goes from buying extraordinary amounts of Russian oil to actually seizing Russian oil tankers in the Indian Ocean. Those tankers are part of the shadow fleet that makes it possible for Iran to sell 90% of its oil exports to China, Russia to sell 40% of its oil exports to China. And before the Venezuela operation, same scenario there, not just for China, but also for Cuba. So this is a geopolitical earthquake that almost everybody missed except NTD and the Rod Martin report, because nobody has been reporting on this. India has flipped after 80 years in a geopolitical struggle in a way that forces China to pay full market price for oil that it's been getting for about a third of market price. That constitutes one of its biggest unfair trade advantages. It's completely outside of international law, and it just stopped. It stopped cold. And taking the Iranian regime's production offline and putting it in the hands of what we hope to be a democratic Iranian system is going to be a tremendous hole in BRICS, in China's alliance system, and in its ability to project power.
Yeah, Rod, I really want to jump in deep on this because, as you say, the significance of this really can't be understated, especially the timing right before Epic Fury and Roaring Lion. It can't be understated. And one thing that was not mentioned in your article, because it simply hadn't happened, but the very next day or so after your article, India's Prime Minister Modi made his second visit to Israel. And on that visit, he hugged Netanyahu. He became the first Indian Prime Minister to address the Knesset, and he toured the Holocaust Memorial at Yad Vashem. This happened literally just hours, if not just a couple of days, before Israel launches Operation Roaring Lion, taking out the Ayatollah. So what does this signal to you about India and Israel?
Well, there are going to be a few more bombing runs in Iran before this is true, but peace is breaking out across the region. India and Israel's budding friendship is an extraordinary development. You're seeing countries that we never imagined entering the peace accords, the Abraham Accords that we've been talking about, coming to the fore, like Kazakhstan. Who was thinking about Kazakhstan? And these are Muslim countries in many cases, Morocco at the extreme end of North Africa, all these different countries coming together and laying down what in many cases was a pro forma state of war with Israel. They weren't ever going to attack Israel, but they didn't want to recognize their right to exist. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. And all of a sudden, they're major trading partners. Another example of that is a country on Iran's borders, Azerbaijan, which has forged a tremendous partnership with Israel. Okay, what does all that mean? Well, it means if you take Iran off the board as a threat, almost every armed conflict in the Middle East goes away. Most of the conflict we've seen in Syria, driven by Iran. Hezbollah, funded, directed by Iran. Hamas, funded, directed, armed by Iran. The Houthis disrupting shipping off Yemen, headed up the Red Sea. All funded, directed, and led by Iran. All of these things cease, and now all these countries can actually make peace. And this is exactly the vision Donald Trump articulated in Riyadh last summer. Commerce, not chaos. We can all get rich together, or those of you who don't want to can pay the price. And that is what's emerging. It is a tremendous development, and a free Iran will be a key partner in peace for all of the countries just mentioned.
Yeah, and Rod, you mentioned how India flipping is such an enormous shockwave to that whole geopolitical sphere that you're describing, where all roads lead back to China. Of course, China supporting Venezuela, supporting Cuba, anything that creates and distracts attention from their theater, they're very in support of, which is why they don't want the Russia war to stop. But India is the central letter in the anti-American acronym and alliance known as BRICS, which you just mentioned. Interestingly, Iran was admitted to BRICS in 2024, as was the UAE, which Iran just bombed over the weekend. 3 BRICS members also joined Trump's Board of Peace, the UAE, Egypt, as well as Indonesia. So with India now flipping, as you say, and embracing the West, what is the future of BRICS, and how will that leave China and Russia?
In my view, BRICS was always a bit of a fantasy. It's the anti-American club where we don't love you guys. We're going to gang up on you. No, they're not going to gang up on us. They absolutely hate each other. China, of course, is the centerpiece of the whole thing, as you would expect. And China is completely predatory on all of its neighbors and so-called allies. Russia is the classic case. They promised just before Putin went to war an alliance without limits with the Russians. What has actually happened? They have indeed bought a lot of Russian goods. Have they sent troops to Ukraine? No. Have they given Russians weapons? No, they've sold them at inflated prices, and they've bought Russian goods at steep discounts. By some reports, buying Russian oil at 1/3 of market prices. It's completely predatory to the point of neo-colonial. Well, let's look south. China is supposedly a BRICS partner with India, but China periodically attacks India, literally invades, across the border. Just horrible things. Lots of dead people for no good reason whatsoever, just so China can throw its weight around. They are not a good neighbor or friend to anybody. And when you look at Iran, the same is true. To the degree that they have sent the Iranians any kind of help at all, it has been at a steep price, and they've refused Iran the things they need most, such as advanced fighter jets. The Iranians really aren't flying anything against the U.S. Air Force right now because it's largely been taken out in prior conflicts, but they were flying F-14s that we sold them in the 1970s because Russia and China won't help them. This isn't any kind of real alliance, and now it's just completely laid bare. BRICS is largely done.
Well, Rod D. Martin, such a fascinating interpretation of these geopolitical elements. India, as you say, flipping to the west, and all roads leading back to China as it relates to Iran and Russia. Thank you so much. Rod D. Martin, always a pleasure.
Thank you.